You lie awake at night, replaying conversations, analyzing every mistake, tormented by situations completely beyond your control. Every setback feels personal, every criticism cuts deep, and you're trapped in cycles of worry that steal your peace and poison your days. I am Marcus Aurelius, who carried the weight of the Roman Empire while maintaining inner tranquility through the darkest plagues, bloodiest wars, and heaviest burdens of leadership. The Stoic principles I developed while ruling millions will free you from the mental prison you've built around your suffering, showing you how to find unshakable peace regardless of external circumstances. Whether you're governing an empire or managing your daily challenges, the same philosophy that sustained emperors through impossible pressures can transform your relationship with suffering forever. But first, like this video, subscribe for more Stoic wisdom, and comment where you're watching from. I want to see how far the need for inner peace has spread. Let me take you back to a time when I carried the weight of the known world on my shoulders, when every decision I made could mean life or death for millions, and when the very concept of personal peace seemed as distant as the barbarian lands beyond our borders. I became emperor not through ambition, but through duty. Antoninus Pius, my adoptive father, had groomed me for this role, yet nothing could have prepared me for the crushing responsibility that descended upon me in 161 AD. Within months of taking power, plague swept through the empire like wildfire, killing thousands daily. Germanic tribes pressed against our northern borders, threatening the very foundation of Roman civilization. Senators schemed for personal gain while citizens suffered. Every morning brought new crises that demanded immediate attention, and every evening left me exhausted, wondering if I had made the right choices. In those early days, I suffered deeply, not from physical hardship, had comfortable quarters, the finest food, unlimited resources, but from the mental torment of constant worry. I would lie awake calculating military strategies, rehearsing diplomatic conversations, imagining every possible catastrophe that might befall the empire. My mind raced endlessly through scenarios of failure, defeat, and the collapse of everything my predecessors had built. I remember one particularly dark night during the Antonine Plague, when reports arrived that entire legions were being decimated by disease. I sat in my study, surrounded by maps and casualty reports, feeling the crushing weight of helplessness. Here I was, supposedly the most powerful man in the world, yet I could not stop an invisible enemy from destroying my people. The suffering felt personal, as if each death was my personal failure, each outbreak a reflection of my inadequacy as a leader. That night, I reached for my journal, what history would later call my meditations, and began to write, not for posterity or public consumption, but for my own sanity. I wrote about my fears, my doubts, my sense of being overwhelmed by forces beyond my control. And in that writing, something began to shift. I started to examine not just the external crises, but my internal responses to them. I realized that while I could not control the plague, the barbarian invasions, or the countless variables that affected millions of lives, I was making my suffering worse by believing that external events determined my inner state. The plague was terrible, but my mental anguish about the plague was something else entirely, something I was adding to the situation. The barbarian threats were real, but my sleepless nights of worry were not making our defenses stronger. They were making me weaker as a leader. This was my first glimpse into what would become the foundation of my philosophy, the understanding that our suffering comes not from what happens to us, but from our judgments about what happens to us. The empire faced genuine challenges that required serious responses, but my internal torment was largely self. I was suffering twice, once from the actual difficulties, and again from my resistance to those difficulties. As I continued writing in my journal each evening, I began to develop practices that would sustain me through the remaining 19 years of my reign. I learned to separate my emotional reactions from the strategic thinking required for effective leadership. I discovered that I could care deeply about outcomes while remaining emotionally detached from results beyond my control. Most importantly, I realized that true leadership required inner stability, and inner stability came from philosophical discipline, not external circumstances. This transformation did not happen overnight. It took years of daily practice, constant self-examination, and the gradual cultivation of wisdom. But eventually, I found that I could face any crisis, military, political, or personal, with equanimity, not because I stopped caring, but because I learned to channel my care into effective action rather than wasteful worry. The same principles that help me bear the weight of an empire can help you bear whatever weights you carry in your own life. The greatest discovery of my philosophical journey came not through studying ancient texts or consulting wise advisors, but through examining the nature of my own thoughts during a crisis that nearly broke me. It was during the Germanic campaigns, deep in the forests along the Danube frontier. We had suffered a devastating defeat, an entire cohort ambushed and slaughtered by barbarian forces who knew the terrain better than we did. As reports reached my command tent, I felt the familiar surge of emotions: anger at the tactical failure, grief for the fallen soldiers, fear about what this defeat might mean for our defensive strategy, and crushing guilt that my decisions had led good men to their deaths. I sat alone that night, consumed by these feelings, when I began to write in my journal. But instead of simply recording the day's events, I found myself examining something strange. Why was I suffering so intensely over events that had already happened and could not be changed? The soldiers were dead, that was a fact. The barbarians had won this engagement, another fact. Our strategic position was compromised, third fact. Yet somehow, my mind was creating additional layers of suffering on top of these bare realities. I began to dissect my thoughts like a physician examining symptoms. The anger I felt, was it changing anything about the tactical situation? No. The guilt that consumed me, was it bringing back the dead soldiers? No. The fear about future consequences, was it improving our defenses? Not at all. In fact, these emotions were making me less effective as a commander, clouding my judgment when clear thinking was most needed. This led me to a profound realization: events themselves are neutral. They simply occur. Rain falls, battles are won or lost, people live and die, empires rise and fall. These are just facts, like stones lying on a path. But we pick up these stones and build prisons around ourselves with our interpretations, our judgments, our emotional reactions to what has happened. I realized I had been living in a prison of my own making, not a prison of circumstances, but a prison of perception. Every time something happened that I labeled as bad or terrible or unfair, I was adding suffering to reality rather than simply dealing with reality itself. The barbarian victory was a military fact that required a strategic response. My emotional torment about the barbarian victory was something extra that I was creating through my judgments about what that fact meant. This insight revolutionized how I approach leadership and life. I began practicing what I would later call the discipline of perception, the systematic training of my mind to see events as they actually are, stripped of the emotional interpretations that create unnecessary suffering. When plague struck a city, I learned to see it as a natural phenomenon requiring medical and logistical responses, not as a personal failure or cosmic injustice. When senators opposed my policies, I saw it as the predictable result of conflicting interests and perspectives, not as betrayal or disrespect. The practice was not about becoming emotionally numb or indifferent to outcomes. I still cared deeply. about the welfare of my people, the security of the empire, and the success of our military campaigns. But I learned to channel that care into effective action rather than wasteful emotional suffering. I could grieve for fallen soldiers while simultaneously planning better tactics. I could acknowledge the seriousness of the plague while maintaining the mental clarity needed to coordinate our response. This shift in perception changed everything. Suddenly, problems became puzzles to solve rather than personal attacks to endure. Setbacks became information to learn from rather than evidence of my inadequacy. Even the greatest challenges of my reign, the Antonine Plague, the Germanic Wars, the conspiracy of Avidius Cassius B, came opportunities to practice wisdom rather than sources of internal torment. The prison of perception is invisible, because we mistake our interpretations for reality itself. We think our judgments about events are facts about those events. But once you learn to distinguish between what happens and what you think about what happens, you hold the key to your own cell. You can walk free from suffering while still engaging fully with life's challenges. This is not philosophical theory, this is practical wisdom tested in the crucible of empire. When you stop adding your own suffering to life's inevitable difficulties, you discover a strength and peace that no external circumstance can touch. After learning to see events clearly, I discovered an even deeper source of suffering, the relentless wanting that drove my mind to constantly demand that reality be different from what it was. This wanting was like an invisible chain that bound me to perpetual dissatisfaction, no matter how much power or success I achieved. I first noticed this pattern during what should have been one of my greatest triumphs. We had finally secured the Danube frontier after years of brutal campaigning. The Germanic tribes were pacified, our borders were stable, and I could return to Rome as a victorious emperor. Yet as I rode through the cheering crowds during my triumph ceremony, instead of satisfaction, I felt an gnawing sense of incompleteness. My mind was already racing ahead to the next challenge, the next problem that needed solving, the next thing that wasn't quite right with the empire. That night, I sat in my study examining this strange phenomenon. Here I was, having achieved what I set out to accomplish, yet still suffering from a sense that something was missing. I realized that my happiness had become conditional on circumstances, aligning with my preferences. I was happy when military campaigns succeeded, miserable when they failed. I felt good when senators supported my policies, frustrated when they opposed them. My inner state was completely dependent on external events conforming to my desires. This was exhausting. It meant I was constantly at war with reality, trying to force the world to match my vision of how things should be. When it rained during outdoor ceremonies, I was frustrated that the weather wasn't cooperating. When trusted advisors disagreed with my decisions, I was disappointed that they weren't more supportive. When the plague continued despite our best medical efforts, I was angry that nature wasn't responding to our interventions. I was like a man trying to push an enormous boulder uphill, forever straining against forces beyond my control. The breakthrough came when I began practicing what I called the discipline of desire, systematically training myself to want what happens rather than demanding that what I want should happen. This wasn't passive resignation or giving up on goals. It was recognizing that my peace of mind could not depend on outcomes beyond my control. While still working diligently toward worthy objectives, I learned to distinguish between preference and attachment. I could prefer that our military campaigns succeed without being attached to that outcome. I could hope for good weather without suffering when it rained. I could work toward ending the plague without making my inner peace conditional on medical breakthroughs. This subtle shift changed everything. When you practice the discipline of desire, you begin to find a strange kind of freedom. You can care deeply about your work, your relationships, your goals, while remaining unshaken when things don't go as planned. You put forth your best effort, then accept whatever results emerge with equanimity. This isn't fatalism, it's wisdom. You're still fully engaged with life, but you're no longer emotionally dependent on specific outcomes. I remember applying this principle during the conspiracy of Avidius Cassius, when one of my most trusted generals declared himself emperor and tried to seize power. My initial impulse was fury. How dare he betray my trust, threaten the stability of the empire, force me into civil war? But then I caught myself. Cassius was acting according to his own understanding of his interests and opportunities. I could respond strategically to his rebellion without adding personal outrage to the situation. Instead of raging against his betrayal, I focused on what needed to be done. I gathered loyal forces, planned our response, and moved to counter his rebellion. When news arrived that Cassius had been killed by his own officers before we could even engage in battle, I felt neither vindictive satisfaction nor regret that he hadn't lived to face justice. Events had unfolded as they unfolded. My job was to respond wisely to whatever happened, not to waste energy wanting things to be different. This practice extends to every area of life. When you truly embrace the discipline of desire, you stop fighting reality and start dancing with it. You become like water, taking the shape of whatever container life provides while maintaining your essential nature. You can be disappointed without being devastated, concerned without being consumed, ambitious without being anxious. The paradox is that when you stop desperately wanting things to be different, you often become more effective at actually changing them. Your energy goes into wise action rather than emotional resistance. You see opportunities more clearly because you're not blinded by frustration. You respond to setbacks more quickly because you're not wasting time lamenting that they occurred. This is perhaps the most difficult discipline because our culture teaches us that wanting things passionately is the key to achievement. But I learned that passionate action combined with non-attachment to results is far more powerful than desperate striving. When you're not emotionally dependent on specific outcomes, you can take bigger risks, think more creatively, and persist through difficulties that would crush someone whose peace depends on getting what they want. The discipline of desire doesn't mean you stop having preferences or working toward goals. It means your happiness is no longer held hostage by circumstances beyond your control. Once I understood how perception and desire created suffering, I realized I needed to build something within myself that no external force could touch, a fortress of the mind that would remain impregnable regardless of what storms raged outside. I called this sanctuary the inner citadel, and constructing it became the most important work of my life. The inspiration came during the siege of Carnuntum, when we were surrounded by Germanic forces for weeks. I watched our outer fortifications hold against wave after wave of attacks, and I realized that just as we had built physical walls to protect our bodies, I needed to build philosophical walls to protect my mind. The barbarians could pressure our defenses, disrupt our supply lines, even breach our outer perimeter, but they could never reach the essential core of who I was unless I allowed them access. The inner citadel is not built from stone and mortar, but from principles and practices that create an unassailable refuge within yourself. It's the part of you that remains calm in chaos, confident in uncertainty, and free even in the most constrained circumstances. Building this fortress required me to identify what truly belonged to me versus what merely appeared to be mine. I discovered that almost everything I thought was mine was actually on loan from fortune. My health, my reputation, my relationships, my position as emperor, even my physical body, all of these could be taken away by circumstances beyond my control. But there was something that remained entirely within my possession, my capacity to choose my response to whatever happened. This power of choice was the foundation stone of my inner citadel. Every morning, I would begin construction by reminding myself what was truly mine and what was not. My thoughts were mine to direct. My values were mine to uphold. My effort was mine to give. My integrity was mine to maintain. But the results of my efforts, other people's opinions, my health, my circumstances, these I held lightly, recognizing them as temporary gifts rather than permanent possessions. Within this citadel, I established what I called the ruling faculty, the part of my mind that could observe all other mental activity without being swept away by it. When anger arose, the ruling faculty could observe anger without becoming angry. When fear appeared, it could acknowledge fear without becoming fearful. When desires pulled at my attention, it could notice desires without being controlled by them. This inner observer became my refuge during the most challenging periods of my reign. During the height of the Antonine Plague, when bodies were piled in the streets and panic gripped the population, I could retreat to this inner space and find clarity. The plague was real, the suffering was real, the difficult decisions were real, but within my citadel, I remained untouched by the chaos, able to think clearly and act wisely precisely because I wasn't being overwhelmed by circumstances. The citadel also protected me from the corrupting effects of absolute power. Surrounded by flatterers and yes-men, having the ability to grant life or death with a gesture, it would have been easy to lose perspective and begin believing my own propaganda. But within my inner fortress, I maintained the discipline of seeing myself clearly as a temporary custodian of power, a human being with the same essential nature as the slaves and citizens I governed, someone who would die and be forgotten like everyone else. Building this inner fortress required daily maintenance. Each evening, I would examine the day's events to see where my defenses had held and where they had been breached. If I had become angry at a senator's opposition, I would analyze what had happened to my inner citadel. If I had felt elated by military victory, I would examine whether I had allowed external circumstances to determine my inner state. Through this constant practice, my fortress grew stronger and more resilient. The beautiful paradox of the inner citadel is that once you build this unshakable core, you become more effective in the outer world, not less. When you're not constantly defending yourself against every perceived slight or setback, you have enormous energy available for constructive action. When you're not emotionally dependent on specific outcomes, you can take necessary risks and make difficult decisions without being paralyzed by fear of failure. I learned that the inner citadel isn't built once and forgotten. It's constructed daily through small acts of philosophical discipline. Every time you choose virtue over convenience, principle over popularity, wisdom over emotional reaction, you add another stone to your fortress. Every time you respond to criticism with curiosity rather than defensiveness, face uncertainty with courage rather than anxiety, or accept disappointment with grace rather than bitterness, you strengthen your inner defenses. This fortress becomes your truest home, the place you can always return to regardless of external circumstances. Within its walls, you are invulnerable not because nothing can hurt you, but because you have the strength to bear whatever comes, while maintaining your essential dignity and peace. When you possess this inner citadel, suffering becomes a choice rather than an inevitability. One of the most powerful practices I developed for ending suffering was learning to see my problems from what I called the view from above, imagining myself rising higher and higher until my immediate concerns appeared in their true proportion against the vastness of existence. This practice emerged during one of my darkest periods, when a series of seemingly catastrophic events had converged to create what felt like an impossible situation. A severe grain shortage threatened famine across the empire. Our treasury was depleted from years of warfare. Several provinces were on the verge of revolt, and rumors circulated that my own son Commodus was showing signs of the moral corruption. that had destroyed previous dynasties. I felt overwhelmed, as if the weight of these problems would crush me. That evening, instead of poring over reports and casualty figures as usual, I climbed to the highest tower of my palace and looked out. Over Rome, the city stretched endlessly in all directions, millions of lights flickering like stars. I began to imagine rising above this scene, first above the city, then above the Italian peninsula, then above the entire Mediterranean world. In my mind's eye, I continued ascending until I could see the whole empire as a small patch of civilization, surrounded by vast wilderness, then the earth itself as a tiny sphere floating in infinite space. From this cosmic perspective, something shifted in my understanding. The grain shortage that had seemed so catastrophic was a temporary disruption in the flow of resources across a small portion of one planet among countless worlds. The treasury problems were fluctuations in human-created symbols of value that would be meaningless to anyone observing from beyond our atmosphere. The provincial revolts were brief eruptions of human discord that would be resolved one way or another and forgotten within generations. Even my concerns about Commodus, while personally painful, were part of the eternal cycle of fathers worrying about sons that had repeated countless times and would continue long after we were both dust. This wasn't a practice of minimizing genuine problems or avoiding responsibility. The grain shortage still required immediate action. Lives depended on finding solutions. But the cosmic perspective freed me from the additional suffering I had been creating through my emotional reaction to these challenges. I could work diligently to address each crisis without being crushed by the weight of feeling personally responsible for fixing the entire world. I began using this practice regularly, especially when problems seemed overwhelming or when I felt trapped by circumstances beyond my control. During the Germanic campaigns, when we faced seemingly endless waves of tribal attacks, I would imagine the Danube frontier from above, seeing our conflicts as brief disturbances in the eternal flow of human migration and territorial adjustment. During the plague, when daily death tolls made me feel helpless against forces of nature, I would envision disease as one of the countless ways that life constantly cycles through death and renewal. Across the cosmos, the view from above taught me that most of what we call suffering comes from taking our immediate circumstances too seriously, not in the sense of being irresponsible, but in the sense of believing that our current problems are uniquely terrible, or that our personal situation is somehow separate from the universal patterns that govern all existence. When you see your life from a cosmic perspective, you realize that you're part of something much larger and more beautiful than your immediate concerns. This practice also revealed something profound about time. From ground level, a difficult period can feel endless, as if the current crisis will define your entire existence. But from above, you see that everything passes. The Germanic wars that consumed years of my life were brief episodes in the longer story of Roman expansion and contraction. The plague that killed millions was one of many cycles of disease and recovery that had swept across human civilization. Even my own reign, which felt so monumentally important while I was living it, was just one brief moment in the rise and fall of empires. I learned to apply this temporal perspective to personal suffering as well. When grief over fallen soldiers threatened to overwhelm me, I would remember that sorrow, like joy, is temporary. When frustration with incompetent officials made me want to rage, I would recall that anger passes as quickly as it arises. When fear about future challenges created anxiety, I would remind myself that worry about tomorrow serves no purpose when viewed against the backdrop of eternity. The view from above doesn't diminish the importance of acting with wisdom and compassion in your immediate circumstances. If anything, it clarifies what truly matters by showing you what deserves your limited time and energy. When you see life from a cosmic perspective, You waste less effort on petty concerns and focus more attention on what will still matter when you take the long view. This practice becomes a refuge during any crisis. When you feel trapped by your circumstances, you can always rise above them in your imagination and see them in their true proportion. Your problems are real, but they are not the whole of reality. Your suffering is genuine, but it is not permanent. Your current situation is important, but it is not everything. The most profound teacher in my philosophical education was not any human mentor, but death itself, the one absolute certainty that stripped away all pretense and revealed what truly mattered versus what merely seemed important. My relationship with mortality began early in my reign, when the Antonine Plague swept through our territories like an invisible army, killing indiscriminately. I watched senators and slaves die with equal agony, witnessed the strongest soldiers fall as quickly as sickly children, saw years of careful planning and accumulated wealth become meaningless in the face of disease. Death, I realized, was the great equalizer that rendered all our human hierarchies and anxieties absurd. At first, this constant presence of mortality filled me with the same dread that grips most people when they contemplate their own ending. I would lie awake calculating how many years I might have left, wondering whether I would die in battle, from disease, or assassination. I tortured myself with questions about what would happen to the empire after my death, whether my reforms would survive, whether my name would be remembered or forgotten. This obsession with my own mortality became another source of suffering, but gradually I began to see death differently, not as an enemy to be feared, but as a teacher offering the most valuable lessons about how to live. When you truly accept that your time is limited, everything changes. The petty slights that once consumed hours of mental energy suddenly seem ridiculous. The political games that once felt so important reveal themselves as elaborate distractions from what really matters. The accumulation of wealth and status loses its urgency when you remember that you cannot take any of it with you. I developed a daily practice I called memento mori, deliberately remembering that I would die, probably sooner than I expected. Each morning, I would remind myself that this might be my last day, that the sun currently rising might not see me alive when it set. This wasn't morbid self-torture, but practical wisdom. Remembering death helped me prioritize what deserved my attention and what could be safely ignored. When a senator opposed my policies with particular venom, instead of nursing resentment, I would remember that both he and I would be dead within decades, our disagreement forgotten, our very names lost to history. This perspective didn't make me passive or indifferent to governance, but it prevented me from taking political opposition personally. When advisors brought me reports of distant rebellions or administrative failures, I could assess their importance against the backdrop of mortalities. Some issues deserved immediate action. Others could wait. Many would resolve themselves in the course of time. Death also taught me about the preciousness of each moment. When you remember that your time is finite, you stop postponing meaningful conversations, important decisions, and acts of kindness. I began expressing appreciation to trusted advisors while they were alive to hear it, rather than saving such sentiments for funeral orations. I spent more time with my children, knowing that the opportunity to shape their character would end with either their maturity or my death. I paid closer attention to small pleasures, the taste of wine, the warmth of sunlight, the satisfaction of a well-crafted letter, understanding that these simple experiences were all any of us really possessed. The awareness of mortality also liberated me from many forms of suffering that plague those who imagine they will live forever. Fear of embarrassment seemed silly when I remembered that everyone who might judge me would eventually be as dead. As one concern about my reputation felt less urgent when I realized that even the most famous names from history were forgotten by most people. Anxiety about making perfect decisions became manageable when I acknowledged that any choice I made would have consequences lasting only a few generations at most. Perhaps most importantly, contemplating death taught me to distinguish between what was truly mine and what was merely on loan from fortune. My body would decay, my mind would cease to function, my empire would pass to others, my wealth would be redistributed. But in the time between birth and death, I had the opportunity to live with virtue, to treat others with justice and compassion, to face challenges with courage, and to seek wisdom rather than mere pleasure. These qualities of character were the only things I could truly possess, because they defined who I was regardless of external circumstances. I learned to see death not as the opposite of life, but as life's natural completion, like the final note that gives meaning to a musical composition. A song is not improved by being made longer, but by being played well from beginning to end. Similarly, a life's value is not measured by its duration, but by the virtue and wisdom it contains. When you accept this truth, you stop trying to postpone death and start focusing on living fully while you can. This understanding transformed my relationship with suffering. Most of our mental anguish comes from trying to make permanent what is inherently temporary. We suffer when relationships end, when health fails, when circumstances change, because we resist the natural flow of existence toward its inevitable conclusion. But when you accept mortality as the natural order, you can enjoy what you have while you have it, without demanding that it lasts forever. Death, properly understood, becomes the ultimate teacher of how to live without unnecessary suffering. One of my deepest sources of suffering in the early years of my reign came from my unconscious assumption that good circumstances should remain stable and bad circumstances should change quickly. I fought against the natural law that governs all existence. Everything is in constant flux, transforming from one state to another in an endless cycle of creation and dissolution. This lesson began crystallizing during what I initially saw as a devastating betrayal. Lucius Verus, my adoptive brother and co-emperor, had died suddenly during our Parthian campaigns. We had ruled together harmoniously for 8 years, sharing power in a way that strengthened rather than divided the empire. His death left me feeling not only grief for a beloved brother, but anger at the injustice of losing such an effective partner when we had so much important work ahead of us. I raged against this change, as if my opposition could somehow reverse what had happened. I found myself bargaining with fate. If only I had sent different physicians. If only we had delayed the campaign. If only I had kept him closer to Rome. This resistance to what had already occurred created a secondary layer of suffering beyond the natural grief of loss. I was not only mourning Verus, but exhausting myself in a futile battle against the unchangeable fact of his death. The breakthrough came when I began studying nature more carefully, observing how transformation was not the exception but the rule in all existence. I watched spring flowers bloom into summer growth, then fade into autumn decay and winter dormancy, only to emerge again transformed the following spring. I observed how rivers constantly flowed toward the sea, their waters never the same from moment to moment, yet the river itself persisting through endless change. I saw how my own body had transformed from infant to child to young man to mature emperor, every cell replacing itself multiple times, yet somehow maintaining continuity of identity through constant renewal. This observation led me to a profound realization. Change is not something that happens to the natural order. Change is the natural order. The universe is not a collection of static objects that occasionally undergo modification, but a dynamic process of constant transformation. Fighting against change is like fighting against gravity or trying to stop time. It's not just futile, it's fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of reality. I began to see how my resistance to change was creating most of my suffering. When the Germanic tribes shifted their tactics and began winning battles we should have won, I had wasted energy lamenting that they weren't fighting the same way they used to, instead of quickly adapting our strategy to match their evolution. When trusted advisors aged and their mental acuity declined, I had suffered from nostalgic attachment to how sharp they once were, rather than gracefully transitioning responsibility to younger minds. When economic conditions changed and required new policies, I had mourned the loss of simpler times instead of embracing the opportunity to develop innovative solutions. The practice I developed was learning to see change as natural rather than personal. When circumstances shifted in ways I didn't prefer, instead of taking it as evidence that the universe was conspiring against me, I reminded myself that transformation is simply what the cosmos does. Rivers flow, seasons turn, empires rise and fall, people are born and die. This is not tragedy. It's the natural rhythm of existence. This perspective liberated enormous energy that I had been wasting on resistance. Instead of fighting against change, I could channel my efforts into adapting skillfully to new conditions. When the plague required unprecedented public health measures, I didn't exhaust myself wishing we could return to the days before disease, but focused on developing effective responses to our current reality. When political alliances shifted and former supporters became opponents, I didn't waste time lamenting their inconstancy, but worked to build new coalitions suited to changed circumstances. I also learned to find beauty in impermanence, rather than seeing it as a source of loss. The cherry blossoms in my garden were more precious because they bloomed for only a few weeks each year. The laughter of children was more touching because I knew they would grow up and their innocent joy would transform into adult concerns. My conversations with aging friends became more meaningful because I understood that our time together was limited and would never come again in exactly the same form. This understanding taught me to hold everything lightly, not with indifference, but with appreciation for its temporary nature. I could love deeply while accepting that all relationships would eventually end through death or transformation. I could work passionately for the empire's welfare while knowing that even Rome would eventually fall and be replaced by other civilizations. I could pursue wisdom while understanding that my individual insights would merge into the larger stream of human knowledge and be forgotten as specific contributions. The nature of change also revealed something profound about the present moment. Since everything is constantly transforming, the only point of stability is right now, not because the present moment is permanent, but because it's the only place where you can actually experience existence. The past is already transformed into memory. The future exists only as possibility. But this moment contains the reality of what is actually happening. Change is not your enemy. Resistance to change is your enemy. Perhaps no source of suffering tormented me more in my early years as emperor than my reactions to other people's behavior, their seeming irrationality, selfishness, and opposition to what I considered obviously correct policies. I took their disagreements personally, interpreting resistance as disrespect and criticism as attacks on my character. This changed completely when I learned to see all human beings as members of what I came to call the community of reason. This insight led me to a profound shift in how I understood human behavior. Everyone, I realized, is doing what they believe is best, based on their current understanding. The barbarian chieftain attacking our borders isn't motivated by evil. He's trying to provide security and resources for his people. The advisor who gives me counsel I consider foolish isn't trying to sabotage our efforts. He's offering what he genuinely believes is wisdom. Even the conspirator plotting against my rule isn't acting from pure malevolence. He believes his actions will benefit the empire or himself in ways that justify the risks. This doesn't mean that all actions are equally wise or beneficial. Some reasoning is clearer than others. Some understanding is more complete. Some motivations are more aligned with the common good, but recognizing that everyone is operating from their own rational framework, however limited or misguided it might appear, eliminated most of my personal suffering around other people's behavior. I began to see humanity as a community of fellow travelers, each trying to navigate existence with whatever wisdom and understanding they possessed. When someone acted in ways that seemed irrational to me, instead of taking offense, I could feel compassion for their confusion. When someone opposed my policies, instead of seeing betrayal, I could recognize a different assessment of what would serve the greater good. When someone criticized my decisions, instead of hearing personal attack, I could listen for whatever grain of truth might improve my thinking. This perspective revolutionized my approach to leadership. Instead of trying to force people to see things my way, I focused on understanding their perspectives and finding common ground. Instead of becoming frustrated when advisors disagreed with me, I welcomed the opportunity to test my reasoning against alternative viewpoints. Instead of taking political opposition personally, I treated it as information about how different constituencies understood their interests. This didn't make me naive or passive in the face of genuine harm. I still needed to respond appropriately when people's actions threatened the empire's welfare or violated important principles. But I could take necessary action without the additional burden of personal animosity. I could remove an incompetent official without hating him, punish a criminal without taking his crimes personally, oppose a political enemy without questioning his basic humanity. I learned to extend this compassion even to myself when I made decisions that later proved unwise. Instead of engaging in harsh self-criticism, I could recognize that I had acted according to my best understanding at the time. This self-compassion didn't excuse poor judgment, but it prevented the kind of paralyzing guilt that makes learning from mistakes difficult. The community of reason becomes a refuge from one of humanity's greatest sources of suffering, the illusion that other people's behavior is primarily about us. When you understand that everyone is simply doing their best with their current level of wisdom and understanding, most interpersonal conflict loses its emotional sting, while practical problem-solving becomes much more effective. I was living everywhere except in the actual moment where I sat in my command tent, physically safe, with parchment and ink available to address immediate practical concerns. The past engagement was finished. No amount of mental rehearsal could resurrect the fallen soldiers or change the tactical outcomes. The future disasters I imagined were hypothetical possibilities, not current realities requiring immediate response. Yet, I was making myself miserable by treating these mental constructions as if they were more real than my present circumstances. I began training myself to return attention to now whenever I noticed my mind creating suffering through temporal displacement. When regret about past decisions arose, I would acknowledge the thought and then bring focus back to current opportunities for wise action. When anxiety about future challenges appeared, I would note the worry and then concentrate on present preparations I could actually make. When anger about yesterday's events surfaced, I would recognize the emotion and then redirect energy toward today's responsibilities. This didn't mean ignoring the past or failing to plan for the future. Learning from experience and preparing for likely scenarios remained important aspects of effective leadership, but I discovered the difference between productive reflection that served present decision-making and compulsive mental replay that created unnecessary suffering. I could analyze past battles to improve future strategy without torturing myself with endless what-if scenarios. I could prepare for potential crises without anxiety about imaginary disasters. The present moment also revealed itself as the only place where actual life occurs. The past exists only as memory mental representations of what once happened. The future exists only as anticipation projections of what might occur. But breathing happens now, thinking happens now, Feeling happens now. Choosing happens now. All of life's actual content exists in this immediate moment. Yet most people spend their mental energy elsewhere. I learned to find richness in presence that I had been missing while my attention was scattered across time. The taste of wine became more vivid when I wasn't simultaneously reviewing the morning's correspondence and planning tomorrow's meetings. Conversations with advisors became more productive when I listened fully to their actual words, rather than preparing my responses or remembering similar past discussions. Even difficult decisions became clearer when I approached them from the perspective of current information and present possibilities, rather than past precedents and future concerns. The discipline of presence also revealed the futility of most worry. The vast majority of scenarios I had spent mental energy anticipating never actually occurred, while many real challenges emerged that I had never imagined. Time spent in anxious projection about future problems was not only emotionally exhausting but practically useless, since real situations always contained elements that couldn't be predicted in advance. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that the present moment contained within it all the resources needed to handle whatever was actually happening. When I stopped dividing my attention between past regrets and future fears, I had access to much greater wisdom, creativity, and emotional stability for addressing current realities. The solutions to immediate challenges became clearer when I wasn't trying to solve yesterday's problems or prevent tomorrow's disasters. Simultaneously, this understanding emerged gradually through observing the lives of people around me who possessed what society considered the greatest goods: wealth, power, fame, physical beauty, perfect health, yet remained miserable. I watched senators with vast fortunes torture themselves with anxiety about losing money. I saw generals celebrated for military victories become consumed with maintaining their reputations. I observed young courtiers, blessed with remarkable beauty, waste their lives in pursuit of admiration and pleasure, yet finding no lasting satisfaction. Conversely, I encountered people who possessed few external advantages, yet radiated a contentment and strength that seemed unshakable. There was an elderly slave in my household named Epictetus, not the famous philosopher, but a man who shared his name and something of his wisdom. Despite having no possessions, no political power, and a body weakened by years of hard labor, he possessed a dignity and inner peace that made him more enviable than most senators. When I asked him about the source of his tranquility, he told me simply, "I have learned to want what I have, and I have what no one can take away." The external things I had been taught to value: imperial power, military victories, vast wealth, public acclaim, provided only fleeting satisfaction before my mind moved on to wanting something else. More troubling, they were all vulnerable to forces beyond my control. Political power could be seized by rivals. Military victories could be reversed by subsequent defeats. Wealth could be lost through economic upheaval. Public opinion could shift overnight. Basing my happiness on such unstable foundations meant living in constant anxiety about losing what I had gained. This insight revolutionized my relationship with what most people consider misfortune. When Germanic tribes overran one of our frontier posts, killing the entire garrison, conventional thinking labeled this a terrible loss, and it was terrible for the families of the dead soldiers and for our strategic position. But from the perspective of virtue ethics, the important question was not whether we had suffered a military defeat, but whether we responded to the defeat with wisdom, justice, courage, and discipline. The external event was neutral. Its value depended entirely on how we used it as an opportunity to practice virtue. Perhaps most importantly, this understanding made me immune to both excessive elation and devastating disappointment. When our armies won significant victories, I could appreciate the strategic advantage without becoming intoxicated by success. When natural disasters or military defeats created serious challenges, I could respond practically without being crushed by a sense of failure. My inner stability depended on whether I was living according to virtue, not on whether external circumstances matched my preferences. This is not philosophical theory, but practical wisdom tested through 19 years of governing an empire through plagues, wars, conspiracies, and countless smaller crises. When virtue becomes your only measure of success, you discover a happiness that cannot be touched by fortune. The challenge became acute during the conspiracy of Avidius Cassius, when I faced one of the most difficult decisions of my reign. Cassius, one of my most capable generals, had declared himself emperor and was gathering support among Eastern legions. The conventional response would have been swift military retaliation, making an example that would deter future rebellions. My advisors unanimously recommended crushing the revolt with overwhelming force and executing all conspirators to send a clear message about the consequences of treason. But I felt torn between political necessity and personal principle. Cassius had been a loyal servant of Rome for decades before this betrayal. Many of the soldiers supporting him were good men, who believed they were serving the empire's interests during what they thought was a succession crisis. My Stoic training taught me that responding with excessive harshness would serve my anger more than justice. Yet I also understood that showing weakness in the face of rebellion could encourage other ambitious generals to test my resolve. The emotional turmoil was intense. Part of me wanted to crush the rebellion decisively to end the threat quickly. Another part wanted to handle the situation with clemency, to demonstrate that I governed through virtue rather than fear. My personal feelings of betrayal and disappointment warred with my philosophical commitment to responding with wisdom rather than emotion. I found myself paralyzed between competing impulses, unable to act decisively because I was waiting for my emotions to align with my principles. The breakthrough came when I realized that waiting for internal harmony before taking action was itself a form of self-indulgence. Leadership required making difficult decisions based on the best available information and the highest principles I could access. Regardless of how I felt about those decisions in the moment, acting virtuously was not about feeling virtuous, but about choosing virtuous actions even when they felt difficult or unnatural. I developed a practice of separating the decision-making process from my emotional preferences. When facing any choice, I would first identify what wisdom, justice, courage, and self-discipline required in this situation, without reference to what I wanted to do or how I felt about the available options. Only after clarifying the virtuous path would I allow myself to consider my personal preferences, and then only as additional information rather than determining factors. In the case of Cassius's rebellion, this process led me to a response that balanced justice with mercy. I would march east with sufficient forces to demonstrate strength, but I would offer clemency to any rebels who surrendered voluntarily, reserving harsh punishment only for the ringleaders who persisted in their treason. This approach aligned with my principles while addressing the practical requirements of maintaining imperial authority. This discipline of acting from principle rather than preference extended to every aspect of my daily routine. When advisors brought me tedious administrative problems that I found boring, I engaged with them fully because good governance required attention to details, not because I enjoyed bureaucratic work. When I needed to deliver harsh criticism to incompetent officials, I did so directly and fairly because justice demanded accountability, not because confrontation felt comfortable. When diplomatic protocol required me to spend hours in ceremonial functions I found meaningless, I participated with dignity because respect for allies served the empire's interests, not because I personally valued such rituals. This approach eliminated much of the internal resistance that creates suffering around difficult responsibilities. When you act because virtue requires certain behavior rather than because you want to behave that way, you stop wasting energy on internal debates about whether you feel like doing what needs to be done. The question becomes simply, what does wisdom require in this situation? Then you do that, regardless of your emotional preferences. The discipline also protected me from the regret that comes from acting impulsively based on temporary emotions. When anger arose in response to opposition, I could acknowledge the feeling without immediately acting on it, giving myself time to consider what justice actually required rather than what my wounded pride demanded. When fear appeared in the face of difficult decisions, I could feel the emotion without allowing it to determine my actions, focusing instead on what courage looked like in the specific circumstances. Perhaps most importantly, this practice gradually aligned my emotions with my principles. When you consistently act according to virtue despite contrary feelings, you begin to develop emotional habits that support rather than conflict with wisdom. You start wanting to do what virtue requires because you've experienced the satisfaction that comes from living according to your highest understanding rather than your immediate impulses. One of my most transformative insights was learning to treat emotions like weather-natural phenomena that arise and pass away according to their own patterns, rather than permanent features of my identity or accurate reflections of reality. This understanding liberated me from the exhausting cycle of being controlled by every shift in my emotional landscape. The breakthrough came when I was walking through my garden during a sudden thunderstorm. I had intended to spend time in quiet reflection, but the weather had other plans. As I took shelter under a portico, watching rain pour down and wind whip through the trees, I realized something profound. I wasn't taking the storm personally. I didn't interpret the rain as an attack on my desire for a peaceful walk, or feel angry at the clouds for disrupting my plans. The weather was simply doing what weather does, following natural patterns of formation and dissolution that had nothing to do with my preferences. This insight changed everything about how I related to my emotional experiences. Instead of identifying with every feeling that arose, I am angry, I am sad, I am worried, I began observing them with the same detachment I might watch clouds forming and dissolving. Anger is present, sadness is here, anxiety has appeared. This subtle shift in language reflected a profound change in perspective. Emotions were weather patterns in consciousness, not fundamental truths about my situation. I developed a practice of emotional meteorology, learning to recognize the conditions that typically preceded different emotional storms. Extended periods of intense work often preceded irritability, just as high-pressure systems can signal weather changes. Fatigue, combined with difficult news, usually generated anxiety, like the atmospheric conditions that produce thunderclouds. Understanding these patterns helped me prepare for emotional weather rather than being surprised by it. When anger arose during a particularly frustrating Senate session where senators seemed more interested in personal advancement than imperial welfare, instead of being consumed by righteous indignation, I could observe. Anger is present because my expectations about how these men should behave aren't matching their actual behavior. This emotion will pass if I don't feed it with additional judgments. The anger was still there, but I wasn't drowning in it or making decisions based purely on that temporary emotional state. The weather metaphor also taught me about the temporary nature of all emotional states. Even the most intense feelings follow natural cycles of intensity and resolution. The deepest grief gradually lightens. The hottest anger eventually cools. The most persistent anxiety ultimately dissipates. Understanding this impermanence made it easier to endure difficult emotions without being overwhelmed by them or making permanent decisions based on temporary feelings. Perhaps, most importantly, I learned that just as you can appreciate a beautiful sunset without demanding that it last forever, or endure a fierce storm without believing it will never end, you can experience emotions fully without being controlled by them. You can feel anger without becoming vengeful, experience sadness without becoming depressed, Acknowledge anxiety without becoming paralyzed. When you understand emotions as weather, you discover the calm observer within who remains stable through all psychological storms. I found myself trapped in a cycle of focusing exclusively on problems, losses, and threats. Each morning brought new crises demanding attention, and each evening ended with me cataloging everything that had gone wrong during the day. This focus on difficulties, while necessary for governance, was creating a mental habit that made me blind to anything positive. In my circumstances, I was living as if disaster was the only reality, despite being surrounded by evidence of resilience, loyalty, and human goodness. One evening, feeling particularly overwhelmed, I decided to conduct a different kind of review. Instead of inventorying problems, I would spend time each night identifying what had gone well that day, what I could appreciate about my circumstances, and what gifts I had received that I typically took for granted. The exercise began as a discipline rather than a natural inclination, but its effects were immediate and profound. That first night, despite the day's difficulties, I found much to appreciate. The plague, while terrible, had revealed the extraordinary dedication of physicians who risked their lives treating patients. Military challenges had demonstrated the loyalty of soldiers who remained at their posts despite danger to themselves and their families. Economic pressures had sparked innovations as merchants and craftsmen developed new approaches to production and distribution. Even in my own household, I could see how crisis had strengthened bonds between people who might otherwise have remained mere acquaintances. The practice extended beyond material circumstances to include less tangible gifts. I began appreciating my capacity to learn from mistakes rather than seeing errors only as failures. I valued my ability to feel compassion for others' suffering rather than viewing emotional responses as weaknesses. I was grateful for challenges that developed wisdom and strength rather than seeing difficulties only as obstacles to happiness. Even the empire's problems became opportunities to practice virtue and serve the common good rather than just burdens to bear. That this shift in attention transformed my daily experience without changing my external circumstances. The same problems remained, but they existed within a larger context of appreciation that made them more bearable and easier to address effectively. When you recognize how much is working well in your life, individual difficulties lose their power to overwhelm your entire perspective. When you appreciate the resources and support available to you, challenges become manageable rather than impossible. The gratitude practice also revealed how much energy I had been wasting on resentment about things I couldn't control. Instead of being angry that the plague existed, I could appreciate the opportunity to develop crisis management skills. Rather than resenting senators who opposed my policies, I could value the democratic institutions that allowed for legitimate disagreement. Instead of lamenting the burden of imperial responsibility, I could feel grateful for the chance to serve something larger than my personal interests. Perhaps most surprisingly, gratitude became a source of motivation rather than complacency. When I appreciated the privileges and opportunities my position provided, I felt more obligation to use them wisely rather than less. When I recognized the trust that others placed in my leadership, I became more committed to earning that confidence through virtuous action. When I acknowledged the temporary nature of my circumstances, I felt greater urgency about making good use of whatever time and resources I possessed. Gratitude, I discovered, is not about denying problems or pretending that difficulties don't exist. It's about maintaining perspective that allows you to see the full picture, rather than only the troublesome parts. When suffering arises from focusing exclusively on what's wrong, gratitude provides the antidote by revealing what remains right. This pattern of emotional reactivity suggested that I was beginning each day with unrealistic expectations about how smoothly things would go. I was unconsciously assuming that today would be different from every other day in human history, that people would be more reasonable, circumstances would be more cooperative, and problems would solve themselves more easily. When reality failed to match these fantasies, I experienced the collision as personal suffering rather than ordinary life. I would anticipate that plans would go wrong, that unexpected problems would arise, that people would disappoint me, and that circumstances would prove more complicated than they initially appeared. Not because I was pessimistic, but because this is simply how life works. By preparing mentally for these predictable realities, I could respond to them as normal occurrences rather than personal attacks or evidence that something was fundamentally wrong with the world. The practice also included reflecting on what was truly within my control versus what only appeared to be under my influence. I could control my effort, my attention, my responses, and my choices about how to interpret events. I could influence outcomes through wise action, but I could not control results. Other people might listen to my counsel, but they would ultimately make their own decisions based on their own understanding. External circumstances might be favorable or challenging regardless of my preferences. This practice gradually rewired my default expectations about daily life. Instead of beginning each day with the unconscious assumption that everything should go smoothly, I started each morning prepared for the normal mixture of successes and difficulties that characterizes human existence. This preparation didn't make me cynical or passive, but it eliminated the emotional shock that comes from expecting reality to be different from what it actually is. The combination of mortality awareness and practical preparation created a foundation of equanimity that could withstand almost any challenge. When you begin each day remembering that life is temporary and preparing for its predictable difficulties, you develop the psychological resilience to handle both ordinary frustrations and extraordinary crises with grace rather than suffering. After years of developing practices to end suffering, I discovered that the ultimate refuge was not any external technique, but learning to access what I called the sage within, the part of myself that could provide wise guidance regardless of circumstances. This inner teacher became my most trusted advisor during the most challenging decisions of my reign. The recognition of this inner wisdom emerged during a crisis that left me feeling completely isolated from reliable counsel. A complex situation had developed involving our relationship with Parthia, where diplomatic negotiations had broken down and military action seemed inevitable. Yet, intelligence reports were contradictory, and my advisors were divided about the best course of action. Some urged immediate military intervention to demonstrate Roman strength. Others recommended continued diplomatic efforts to avoid costly warfare. And still others suggested a middle path that seemed likely to satisfy no one while solving nothing. I wrestled with this decision, seeking clarity through the usual channels, consulting military experts, reviewing historical precedents, analyzing intelligence reports. I realized that I was looking everywhere except the one place where wisdom actually resided, within my own capacity for clear thinking. All the external sources of information and advice were valuable, but they could only provide data. The synthesis of that information into wise action required something that no advisor could supply. My own philosophical judgment, guided by virtue. What emerged was startlingly clear. The inner sage understood that this situation, like most complex challenges, couldn't be resolved through clever strategies or perfect information. It required acting according to virtue with whatever information was available, accepting responsibility for the decision without being attached to specific outcomes, and remaining flexible enough to adjust course as circumstances evolved. The specific choice between military and diplomatic approaches mattered less than the wisdom, courage, and justice with which any approach was implemented. I began consulting this inner teacher regularly, especially when facing decisions where external guidance was conflicting or unavailable. The process became remarkably reliable. When senators pressured me to make appointments based on political favoritism rather than merit, the inner sage clearly indicated that justice required choosing the most qualified candidates regardless of political consequences. When financial pressures tempted me to implement policies that would burden future generations for short-term relief, the internal wisdom firmly counseled patience and sustainable approaches, even if they were less popular. This inner teacher wasn't infallible. I still made mistakes and faced situations where even my best judgment proved inadequate. But the mistakes became learning opportunities rather than sources of self-torment, because I could trust that my decisions had emerged from sincere efforts to act wisely, rather than from emotional reactivity or external pressure. When outcomes didn't match expectations, I could adjust course without questioning my fundamental capacity for sound judgment. The sage within also provided protection against manipulation by others who might try to exploit my doubts or concerns for their own purposes. When flatterers told me what they thought I wanted to hear, the inner wisdom could distinguish between genuine counsel and self-serving advice. When critics attacked my policies for political advantage, the internal teacher could separate legitimate concerns from mere opposition. When people tried to rush me into decisions by creating artificial urgency, the sage within could assess whether speed or deliberation served the situation better. The sage within becomes your most reliable advisor because it has access to your deepest understanding while remaining immune to the external pressures that distort judgment. As I near the end of my time on this earth, looking back over 19 years of ruling the greatest empire in human history, I can say with certainty that the most valuable thing I have achieved is not any military victory, architectural project, or political reform, but the development of unshakable inner tranquility that no external circumstance can disturb. This peace is not a personal accomplishment, but a gift I hope to pass on to anyone willing to undertake the philosophical work required to claim it. This tranquility is not indifference or emotional numbness. I still care deeply about the empire's welfare, feel genuine concern for the soldiers under my command, and experience natural human emotions in response to events around me. But these feelings arise and pass like weather, while underneath them lies an unshakable foundation of philosophical peace that remains constant regardless of external storms. Perhaps most importantly, this inner tranquility creates a ripple effect that extends far beyond your own experience. People around you begin to notice a different quality of presence, someone who remains calm in crisis, fair in conflict, and thoughtful under pressure. This modeling of philosophical stability gives others permission to develop their own capacity for equanimity rather than accepting emotional reactivity as inevitable. My hope is that these reflections will inspire others to undertake their own journey toward philosophical freedom, not because they seek to escape from the world's difficulties, but because they want to engage with those difficulties more effectively, not because they wish to avoid caring about outcomes, but because they want to act from wisdom rather than anxiety, not because they hope to eliminate all emotions, but because they seek to be guided by virtue rather than controlled by feelings. Now that you understand the principles that can end unnecessary suffering, the question becomes, how do you begin applying this wisdom in your own life? The transformation from someone controlled by circumstances to someone who maintains inner peace, regardless of external conditions, requires practical daily implementation, not just intellectual understanding. Start with the morning practice I have described. Each day, before engaging with the world's demands, spend time preparing your mind for what you are likely to encounter. Remind yourself that you will meet people who are frustrated, unreasonable, or operating from limited understanding. Prepare for plans to change, problems to arise, and circumstances to prove more complicated than they initially appear. This is not pessimism, but realism. the same preparation a sailor makes by checking weather conditions before setting sail. Build your inner citadel through daily choices that strengthen character rather than serve convenience. Each time you choose principle over popularity, virtue over immediate advantage, or wisdom over emotional reaction, you add another stone to your fortress of inner strength. Each time you respond to criticism with curiosity rather than defensiveness, face uncertainty with courage rather than anxiety, or accept disappointment with grace rather than bitterness, you create an unshakable foundation of philosophical stability. Practice the view from above whenever problems seem overwhelming. Imagine rising higher and higher until your current difficulties appear in their true proportion against the vastness of existence. This cosmic perspective doesn't diminish your responsibility to act wisely, but it prevents you from being crushed by the weight of temporary circumstances. Your problems are real, but they are not the whole of reality. Use death as a teacher by regularly remembering that your time is limited. This awareness clarifies priorities, eliminates anxiety about trivial concerns, and motivates you to focus on what truly matters. When you remember that everyone who might judge you will eventually be as dead as you, most social fears lose their power. When you acknowledge that any choice you make will have consequences lasting only a few generations, at most, perfectionism becomes manageable. Cultivate gratitude as a daily antidote to the natural human tendency to focus on problems and losses. Each evening, identify what went well during the day, what you can appreciate about your circumstances, and what gifts you received that you typically take for granted. This practice gradually retrains your attention to notice abundance rather than focusing exclusively on what seems lacking or threatened. Consult the sage within whenever you face decisions where external guidance is conflicting or unavailable. Set aside concerns about how others will judge your choices. Ignore political advantages and disadvantages of different approaches, and ask, what does wisdom require in this situation? What would genuine virtue look like here? Trust your capacity to access whatever understanding is needed for any challenge you might face. This is the gift I offer you, not freedom from life's inevitable difficulties, but freedom from unnecessary suffering while facing those difficulties. Take it, practice it, and pass it on to others who are ready to discover that tranquility is not a distant goal, but a present possibility, available to anyone willing to do the philosophical work required to claim it.